Imagine the feeling of cold, unyielding iron pressed against your skin. Not for a day, not for a week, but for years. An intricate cage of metal and leather, locked tight around your waist and between your legs. It has only two small openings, engineered for the body's most basic, unavoidable functions. Every movement is a careful negotiation against the chafe of metal on tender flesh. Every moment is a reminder of your imprisonment. You are not a criminal in a dungeon. You are a noble woman in your own home, and this device, this instrument of torture, was a gift from your husband. He called it a token of his love, a shield for your honor, while he was away fighting his holy war. But as the days bleed into months, and the months into years, the truth becomes brutally clear. This is not a shield. It is a cage built from his jealousy, a physical manifestation of his belief that your body is his property to be locked away like treasure. Now, imagine the news arrives. His caravan was ambushed. He is dead, and the one and only key to your freedom is lost forever, thousands of miles away in a forgotten desert. The iron, once merely a prison, now begins its slow, agonizing work. The leather hardens and cracks. The metal rusts, biting into your skin, creating weeping sores that refuse to heal. An unseen fire of infection begins to burn through your body. The cage of jealousy is now your tomb, and you are being consumed by it, piece by agonizing piece. This is the image of the chastity belt that has been seared into our collective imagination. A story of medieval brutality, of crusaders marching off to war, leaving their wives locked in hideous contraptions. It is a story of ultimate possession and female suffering. But what if I told you that this horrifying story, this entire narrative of the knight and his locked-up lady, is almost completely false? The truth behind this infamous device is far more complex, more bizarre, and in some ways even more disturbing than the myth we've all been told. It is a story not of the Middle Ages, but of Renaissance fantasy, Victorian obsession, and a truth so strange it has been deliberately buried for centuries. To find the real story of the chastity belt, we must first kill the myth. The image is iconic. The valiant knight, banner flying, rides off to the Holy Land. In his wake, his lady weeps, her sorrow compounded by the cold iron. Her husband has just locked around her hips. It is a powerful scene, featured in countless books and movies. It is also almost certainly a fabrication. Let's apply simple, brutal logic to this scenario. The Crusades were not weekend trips. Knights were often gone for years, sometimes for a decade or more. Many never returned. The journey itself was perilous, and battles, disease, and starvation claimed countless lives. To lock a woman into a device like this for such an indefinite, extended period would not be an act of preserving fidelity. It would be a death sentence. Think of the basic, unavoidable realities of the human body. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was already a challenge. Now add a permanent, non-removable metal and leather structure. The constant friction would create sores and abrasions almost immediately. These open wounds, in a pre-antibiotic era, were an open invitation to catastrophic infection and sepsis. Menstruation would become a nightmare of filth and disease, trapped within the device. Urination and defecation, while possible through small apertures, would be unsanitary and lead to constant inflammation and skin breakdown. The device would become a breeding ground for bacteria, a torture instrument that slowly poisoned its wearer from the outside in. No man, no matter how jealous, who wished for his wife to be alive upon his potential return would subject her to this. He would be returning not to a faithful wife, but to a corpse. Furthermore, where is the evidence? For an object supposedly so commonplace among the nobility, there is a stunning, deafening silence in the historical records of the actual medieval period. We have thousands of letters, chronicles, legal documents, wills, and personal diaries from the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. They detail every aspect of medieval life, from land disputes to dinner menus to marital contracts. Yet in all this vast documentation from the time of the Crusades, there is not a single unambiguous mention of a wife being fitted with a chastity belt by her departing husband. No legal complaints from women forced to wear them. No wills specifying what to do with the key upon the husband's death. No merchant records detailing their manufacture or sale. It is a ghost. The entire narrative seems to have been invented much, much later. So if the Crusaders weren't using them, where did the idea even come from? The first concrete drawing of a chastity belt appears in a manuscript from around the year 1405, but its context is the key. The book is called Bellefortis, which translates to The Strong in War. It was written by a German military engineer named Konrad Kaiser. This was not a book of domestic advice. It was a technical manual on warfare and siegecraft. It was filled with drawings of trebuchets, crossbows, cannons, siege towers, and even fantastical devices like rocket-propelled cats intended to set fire to enemy castles. And nestled among these diagrams of war machines and bizarre weaponry is a single clear illustration of what is unmistakably a chastity belt. The accompanying Latin text is brief and somewhat cryptic, but it is laced with satire. Kaiser writes, Est Florentinarum hoc bracile dominarum ferium et durum ex adamante. Sic seri debir iubent. This translates to, these are the iron pants of Florentine women, hard as diamond. Thus they command that they should be locked. This is not a straightforward description of a common item. It is a joke. It is a piece of pointed satire. In the 15th century, Florence had a reputation across Europe, rightly or wrongly, for licentious women and deeply paranoid, jealous husbands. Kaiser, the German engineer, was essentially making a caricature. He was creating a visual punchline. Those Florentine husbands are so crazy with jealousy, he implies. This is the kind of insane thing they must be using to lock up their wives. His drawing was likely a curiosity, a theoretical invention, a piece of social commentary, or a bawdy joke among engineers. It was the medieval equivalent of a political cartoon, not a blueprint for a widely manufactured product. This satirical seed, planted in a military textbook, is where our story truly begins. It took root in the fertile ground of the Renaissance and the early modern period, an era that loved bawdy humor and tales of cunning wives and foolish, cuckolded husbands. The idea of the chastity belt was too good a comedic prop to pass up. It began appearing in popular literature, not as a historical reality, but as a fictional device to drive plots and mock human folly. The great French writer Francois Rabelais, in his series of novels, Gargantua and Pantagruel, has a character named Panurge, who, paranoid about his future wife cheating on him, consults various sources of wisdom. One character suggests that to ensure his wife's fidelity, he should not marry at all, or if he does, he should acquire a cadenas de virtue, a padlock of virtue, from a town famous for making them. The entire exchange is comedic, highlighting the absurdity of such a man's fears. The chastity belt here is a symbol of his ridiculous insecurity. It wasn't just comedy. The belt became a powerful metaphor. Philosophers and social critics used it to discuss the nature of fidelity, love, and the oppressive control of women. In Voltaire's satirical works, the chastity belt appears as a symbol of pointless, tyrannical jealousy. He mocks the idea that virtue can be secured with a lock and key. For these thinkers, the belt wasn't a real object from a barbaric past. It was a perfect allegory for the backward, irrational social constraints they were fighting against in their own time. It represented the cage of patriarchy, the idea that a woman's sexuality was a dangerous force that had to be physically contained by men. So, for centuries, from the 1400s to the 1700s, the chastity belt lived primarily in the world of ideas. It was a joke, a story, a metaphor. But then something changed. Something happened that took this fantasy and tried to hammer it into a physical, historical fact. That something was the 19th century. The Victorian era. The Victorians were obsessed with the Middle Ages, but they saw it through a very particular distorted lens. They viewed it as a time of chivalric romance on one hand, and grotesque, superstitious barbarism on the other. This barbaric view was incredibly useful to them. It allowed them to look back at the Dark Ages and feel smugly superior about their own enlightened, industrial society. They wanted to see the past as a freak show, and the chastity belt was the perfect exhibit. This cultural obsession created a booming market for medieval artifacts, and where there is a market, there are forgeries. Enterprising blacksmiths and metalworkers of the 18th and 19th centuries saw an opportunity. They started to physically create the objects that, until then, had only existed in satirical drawings and bawdy stories. They took the descriptions from Kaiser and Rabelais and brought them to life in iron and steel. These were not ancient artifacts, they were brand new creations, often artificially aged with acid and rust to look convincing. They were sold to private collectors, and even unsuspecting museums, eager to own a tangible piece of medieval cruelty. If you go to a museum today and see a chastity belt on display, you are almost certainly looking at one of these 19th century fabrications. How can we be so sure? The craftsmanship is often a dead giveaway. Many of these medieval belts are constructed with technologies, like coiled springs and screw threads, that simply did not exist or were not used in that manner during the Middle Ages. The decorative elements, the elaborate scrollwork, the velvet linings, often betray a 19th century aesthetic, a romanticized and theatrical idea of what medieval objects should look like. One of the most famous examples is the Chastity belt once held in the Cluny Museum in Paris. For decades it was presented as a genuine artifact once belonging to Catherine de' Medici. It was a centerpiece of their collection, a chilling testament to Renaissance cruelty. But in the late 20th century, rigorous analysis proved it was a fake. The construction, the materials, the design, it all pointed to the 19th century. The museum, to its credit, eventually removed it from display. The Victorians didn't just forge the objects, they forged the history to go with them. It was 19th century historians and antiquarians who retroactively inserted the Chastity belt into the Crusades narrative. They took the fantasy and presented it as fact, using the forged objects as proof. They created the story we all know today, not because the evidence led them there, but because it fit their preconceived notions of the medieval world as a dark and barbaric place. The myth served a purpose. It reinforced the Victorian belief in progress and their own moral and technological superiority. But the story has another, darker and more grounded twist. While the widespread use of chastity belts in the Middle Ages is a myth, this does not mean that similar devices never existed or were never used. But their real purpose was often very different, and in some ways, far more insidious than simple jealousy. We need to shift our focus from controlling women's fidelity to controlling women's sexuality itself, and not just from external forces, but from within. From the 18th century onwards, a new medical and moral panic swept across Europe. The terror of masturbation. What was once considered a minor sin became viewed as a catastrophic disease, a secret vice that could lead to insanity, blindness, epilepsy, and a host of other terrifying ailments. Doctors and moralists wrote extensive tracts on the horrors of self-pollution, and a veritable industry sprang up to cure it. This panic was not limited to men. Female masturbation was seen as particularly dangerous, a sign of nymphomania and moral decay that could render a woman unfit for her primary duties of marriage and motherhood. And so, a new kind of device emerged. These were not the heavy, ornate cages of Victorian fantasy. They were often simpler, more medical in appearance. They were sometimes prescribed by doctors or enforced by parents to protect young people, especially girls, from their own bodies. These were not about preventing intercourse with another person, they were about preventing self-pleasuring. The cage's purpose shifted from locking others out to locking the wearer in, cutting them off from their own desires. Suddenly, the controller was not a jealous husband thousands of miles away, but the immediate authority of a doctor, a parent, or even the woman herself, conditioned by society to fear her own natural urges. These devices were part of a broader war on the female body, a belief that female sexuality was a wild, hysterical force that needed to be tamed and controlled for the good of society. It is a much more subtle and pervasive form of control than a crusader's padlock. It is the internalization of the cage, the belief that one's own body is an enemy that must be restrained. This brings us back to the question at the heart of our investigation. Was the chastity belt a tool of protection, or a cruel cage of jealousy? We have established that the cage of jealousy narrative is largely a myth. But what about protection? Could there be any truth to that? Here we enter a realm of dark speculation, one with little concrete proof, but a chilling degree of plausibility. Life for many women throughout history, especially those traveling alone or living in unstable regions, was incredibly dangerous. The threat of sexual assault was a constant, terrifying reality. Is it conceivable that in some extreme circumstances, a woman might have chosen to wear a protective device herself? Not for years on end, but for a specific, dangerous journey. It is a horrifying thought to choose to lock oneself into a cage as the lesser of two evils. To choose the pain and discomfort of a metal device over the trauma of rape. There is no direct historical evidence for this. No woman's diary reads, "Today I will don't my chastity belt for the perilous road to the next town." But the lack of evidence doesn't make it impossible. Such an act would have been one of desperation, done in secret, and not something likely to be recorded. It flips the entire narrative on its head. The belt is still a cage, but the jailer is no longer a jealous husband. The jailer is a violent, predatory world that offers a woman no other form of safety. In this grim scenario, the device is not a symbol of her subjugation to one man, but a desperate, brutal shield against the potential violence of all men. It is an act of agency, but an agency born of pure terror. The choice between imprisonment and violation is no choice at all. It is simply one form of hell chosen over another. Whether the device was a fantastical symbol of jealousy, a medical tool for suppressing sexuality, or a desperate hypothetical shield against assault, we must now confront the physical reality. We must return to the image we began with, the feeling of iron on skin. Let's strip away the myths and the speculation and focus on the sheer, brutal mechanics of what wearing such an object, for any length of time, would do to a human body. The initial application would be an act of humiliation. The cold metal, the click of the lock, the immediate restriction of movement. This is a profound psychological violation, a statement that your body is no longer your own. Then comes the physical torment. The edges of the belt, no matter how well padded, would dig into the groin and hips with every step, every shift in posture. Walking would become a shuffling gait to minimize the friction. Sitting for long periods would be agony as the pressure points dug in. Skin, trapped beneath unbreathable leather and non-rust-proof iron, would quickly become a swamp of sweat and grime. Rashes would be inevitable. The skin would break down, turning red, then raw, then into open sores. With the skin barrier breached, infection is the next logical step. The area is naturally teeming with bacteria. Trapped in a warm, moist, and unclean environment, these bacteria would thrive. Folliculitis, cellulitis, abscesses. These would not be risks, but certainties. The small openings for bodily functions would be a constant source of misery. Every act of urination would splash onto the device, the ammonia stinging the raw skin and encouraging further bacterial growth. The smell would be unimaginable, a constant humiliating halo of filth. Menstruation would be a catalyst for disaster. The flow of blood, unable to be properly managed, would pool and clot, adhering to the skin and the device. It would provide a rich nutrient medium for bacteria, dramatically increasing the risk of not just localized infection, but a systemic one. Toxic shock syndrome, a fast-acting and deadly condition, would be a constant threat. The pain would be a symphony of different agonies. The sharp pain of chafing, the burning pain of rashes, the deep, throbbing pain of infection. Simple actions we take for granted. A deep breath that expands the abdomen, bending to pick something up, finding a comfortable position to sleep, would all be sources of fresh pain. And over time, the body would begin to fight back in horrifying ways. The flesh might try to grow over or around the foreign object, embedding the iron into the body itself. The constant inflammation and pressure could damage the underlying nerves and muscles. The psychological toll would be just as devastating as the physical one. The constant pain and discomfort, the filth, the humiliation, the utter lack of freedom. It is a state of perpetual torture. Hope would corrode just as surely as the iron rusted. It is a slow, agonizing descent into a living hell. This is the reality that gets lost in the jokes about cuckolded husbands and the romanticism of forged artifacts. This is the truth of what happens when you encase a human being in iron. It is a machine designed to destroy a person, physically and mentally. So, after this journey through myth, forgery, satire, and medical horror, what are we left with? The chastity belt, a tool of protection, or a cruel cage of jealousy? The answer is that it was, and is both, and neither. It was never the widespread tool of jealous crusaders that the myth suggests. That part is a lie, a ghost story created centuries later to make the past seem more barbaric. In its most real and tangible form, it existed as a fantasy, a satirical drawing in a war manual, a comedic prop in a bawdy play, a powerful metaphor for philosophers railing against oppression. It was a cruel cage in the imagination, a symbol of the deepest, most possessive forms of jealousy. Then, in a twisted act of historical necromancy, the Victorians took this fantasy and forged it into a physical reality. They built the cages that their imagined medieval ancestors had not, creating museum pieces that told a thrilling but false story. In this sense, the cruel cage was a product of 19th century delusion, not medieval practice. The story also hides a darker, more clinical truth. The truth of similar devices used not for fidelity, but for health. The cage here was not one of jealousy, but of medical and moral panic, designed to protect women from their own bodies, to enforce a terrifying vision of purity. This was a cage of societal control, masquerading as care. And finally, there is the most horrifying possibility of all. The shadow of the cage as a shield. The desperate, unproven choice of self. Imprisonment as a defense against a violent world. Here the cage is a symbol of a complete societal failure to protect women, leaving them with only the most brutal of options. The chastity belt is ultimately a phantom. It haunts our history more as a powerful idea than as a common object. But the ideas it represents are far from phantom. The jealousy that seeks to possess and control another person is real. The societal pressure to police women's bodies and sexuality is real. The violence that forces women to live in fear is real. The physical iron cage may be a myth, a forgery, a misinterpretation. But the invisible cages are all around us. The true horror of the chastity belt is not that thousands of women were locked into them in the Middle Ages. The true horror is that the mindset that could even conceive of such a device, a mindset of ownership, of control, of reducing a human being to property, has not been relegated to the pages of history. It still exists. The materials may have changed from iron and leather to social pressure, economic dependence and restrictive laws, but the desire to lock away a woman's autonomy remains. The question was never really about the belt itself. The question is about the cage, and we are all still trying to find the key.